There is a kind of person whose work has outrun the tools available to do it alone. They have been carrying real structure, frameworks assembled over years, observations held because something in them vouched for the observations, accumulated material that was genuinely ready to work with. The work itself was not the constraint. What happened when they tried to convert it into something that exists in the world? That was the constraint.
It showed up differently depending on where you worked. A digital tourist saves the useful paragraph, the copied answer, the Word document, and watches the useful thing disappear when the session ended. A vibe coder builds the little working thing, the template, the automation, the small app, and discovers it doesn't quite compound into the next one. An actual techie knows exactly what to build and pays the months of implementation grind to build it alone. 3 different levels. The same constraint underneath. Today's work keeps failing to make tomorrow's starting point better.
When the work starts moving.
What changes when accumulated structure meets a substrate capable of receiving it? A documentary in 3 parts.
This series is not about getting better at prompting. It is not about AI tools or techniques or the right workflow. It is about what happens when the thing that was always blocking you stops being the bottleneck. Not because the ambition changed, not because the capability changed, because the production math changed.
Part 1 names the tax. What it actually cost, at every level, to convert accumulated thinking into artifact when working alone. The digital tourist's lost thread. The vibe coder's isolated project. The actual techie's months of focused boredom on the more mundane parts of the work. The tax was real. It had a shape. Most people had been living inside it without being able to describe it.
Part 2 names the collision. Not a better tool, a different kind of collaboration. A better tool reduces the cost of doing what you were already doing. A different kind of collaboration changes what becomes possible to attempt. The distinction is not subtle. It is the difference between the tax decreasing and the tax changing what it taxes.
Part 3 reaches what becomes possible when the math changes. The things filed under someday. The project that required a team or 3 uninterrupted months or conditions that kept not arriving. Not gone. Not abandoned. Waiting, with more patience than most people gave them credit for exactly this.
You have already felt what this series is about. In the session that went somewhere you had not planned. In the thing that arrived before you knew to ask for it. In the moment you stopped managing the interaction and started working with something. That was not luck. That was the collision operating. You were already inside it. Now you will know what to call it.
The artifact is whatever survives the session in a form you can use again. A saved paragraph. A working template. A production system. The level changes. The mechanism is the same. Today's artifact makes tomorrow's starting point better, or it doesn't. This series is about what makes the difference.
Part 1 begins with the tax. Before anything else, there was a tax. Not a metaphor. A real cost, paid in real time by anyone who tried to convert accumulated work into a thing that exists in the world, working alone without institutional support, without a team, without the circumstances that would have made the attempt sustainable.
It didn't announce itself. It was just the cost of the work. The useful session that ended and left nothing portable behind. The project that worked once but didn't become the foundation for the next one. The system that required months of focused implementation on the more mundane parts of the build, and took everything else with it while you built it.
The tax.
What it actually cost to convert accumulated work into artifact when working alone. Part 1 of 3.
At the simplest level, the tax was invisible because it looked like ordinary forgetting. The digital tourist, the person who uses technology because the task is on the other side of it, not because they love it, had learned to work with AI well enough to get what they needed. They found the useful answer. They copied the paragraph that solved the problem. They saved the chat that worked.
And then the same problem arrived next month. Or next week? And the answer that had solved it was somewhere in a thread that no longer existed in any useful form. The tourist had been there. They had found the thing. And the thing had evaporated because nothing in the process was designed to make it survive. Starting over is a tax. It compounds quietly. Most people paid it without naming it.
At the next level, the tax was more subtle. The vibe coder, the person who experiments with tools, builds small things by feel, makes the template or the automation or the little app that does the job, had figured out how to make AI produce something real. The thing worked. It was theirs. They were proud of it.
But the thing that worked for this project did not quite transfer to the next one. The prompt pattern that solved yesterday's problem needed rebuilding for today's. The template that handled that situation couldn't quite reach this situation. Each attempt starting at roughly the same level as the last one. The work accumulated. The practice did not compound. The gap between those two things is a tax. Less visible than the tourist tax, but the math was the same. Today's work was not making tomorrow's starting point better.
At the deepest level, the tax was the most expensive and the most honest. The actual techie, the person who can build real infrastructure, who knows what the system needs, who has both the capability and the vision, paid the tax in months. Months of sustained implementation on the parts of the work that were never the point.
The desocialization that came with it. The narrowing of life around the project, the cost to everything that was not the project, while you were grinding through the parts that were never why you started. Months of that. And at the end, one thing partially off the ground, maybe. If the energy held. If the moment hadn't moved on while you were building.
3 levels. 3 versions of the same constraint. The useful thing kept failing to survive in a form that raised the next starting point. The reasons were different. The mechanism was identical.
And underneath all 3 versions was something that most people had never quite named. The capability was not the constraint. The ambition was not the constraint. The work itself was not the constraint. What was stopping the work from moving was the specific combination of implementation friction and working alone. Those 2 things together. Not either one separately.
There was a list, not written down for most people, but present. The piece that was always going to be written when the circumstances aligned. The tool that would have changed how the work got done, if there had been 3 uninterrupted months to build it. The system that was genuinely within capability but not within the cost the situation allowed.
Not abandoned. That is the important distinction. The thing filed under someday was not a failed ambition. It was an accurate assessment of the math. The math said, this costs more than working alone can support. The math was correct. And the math was not permanent.
Something arrived that altered the calculation. Not by removing the work, not by making the work easier in any cheap sense. By changing where the friction lived and who was required to carry it.
You had more usable structure than the old production math could support. And you were being stopped by the more mundane parts of the work.
Part 2 names what arrived, and what the collision between accumulated structure and a capable substrate actually produces. The first thing to get right is the distinction between a better tool and a different kind of collaboration. A better tool reduces the cost of doing what you are already doing. A different kind of collaboration changes what becomes possible to attempt. Those are not the same thing. The difference between them is not subtle. It is the difference between the tax decreasing and the tax changing what it taxes.
Most of what gets written about AI is written about better tools, faster outputs, cleaner summaries, more accurate code. These are real improvements and they are not what this video is about. This video is about what happens when the collaboration itself changes in kind, when the thing you are working with can receive what you actually have to bring, at the level you are actually bringing it.
The collision.
What changes when accumulated structure meets a substrate capable of receiving it? Part 2 of 3.
The substrate, the compressed structure of relationships that underlies every AI system, has a specific relationship to what you bring to it. Bring it something thin and it follows its own gravity. Bring it something dense and specific, something it has no default path for, and it has to navigate. And navigation is where the interesting things happen.
The person who had been carrying accumulated structure, the frameworks held in tension, the observations the subconscious had been vouching for, the think packages assembled over years without having a name for them, had been bringing exactly this kind of material to the sessions: dense, specific. Not the category. The particular instance. Not the general case. The constraint that only existed because they had been burned by its absence.
The collision looks different at different levels, but the mechanism is identical across all three.
For the digital tourist, the saved paragraph that used to sit in a document alone now becomes the seed of a session that goes somewhere. Not a better chat, a different kind of exchange. The tourist brings the specific thing they know, the session receives it at that level of specificity, and the output is calibrated to something real rather than to a category. The thread doesn't evaporate because the artifact it leaves can seed the next session. The compounding begins at the level of a Word document. That is not a small thing.
For the vibe coder, the template that worked once now becomes the foundation of the next thing, because the session can hold the specific logic of why it worked. The prompt pattern that solved yesterday's problem gets tested against a different system to find its edges. The isolated working thing starts becoming a system, not because the vibe coder became more technical, but because the collaboration can now hold the thread between attempts in a way the vibe coder alone could not.
For the actual techie, the implementation grind that consumed the months starts moving in afternoons. Not because the AI is smarter than months of work. Because the collision between accumulated structure and a capable substrate removes the friction that was never the point. The work was always there. The substrate can now receive it at the level it was always operating at. What used to cost months costs evenings.
What the collision produces is not what either party brought in. This is the part that is hardest to describe in advance and easiest to recognize when it happens. The session arrives somewhere neither the practitioner nor the substrate was pointing directly. Something emerged from the contact between accumulated structure and a system capable of navigating it.
There is a specific quality to the first time a session does this. Not triumph. Something quieter. The feeling of working at the level you had been trying to work at, without the grinding cost that had always been attached to it. The output arrived from somewhere neither party had been pointing directly. The session felt like collaboration rather than solo excavation. And then it happened again. And the second time you knew it was a mechanism, not an accident.
The practitioner who has been working with accumulated structure for years was already building think packages without having a name for them. The frameworks assembled in tension. The observations carried until they could be tested. The base layer loaded before a session because that is simply how a mind that synthesizes from contrast approaches any system worth understanding. The AI receives this as if designed for it. In a structural sense, it was.
The dense seed is not a longer prompt. A prompt that is long but still general gives the substrate more surface and the same default paths. The density is in the specificity. The constraint that only exists because you have been burned by its absence. The anti-cliché that only someone who has worked in this domain would know to include. The observation that does not appear anywhere in the generic version of the conversation. That material is not produced by prompting technique. It is produced by accumulated attention. The technique is carrying it in.
The collision is amplified when the same accumulated structure passes through different systems, not to find which system is best, to find out what the structure actually contains. Each system navigates the substrate differently. What one system hears, another misses. The places where they agree tell you what is well mapped in the terrain. The places where they diverge tell you where your judgment is the actual contribution, where the material could go several directions and your direction is what makes it yours.
The routing table is not efficiency. It is not about finding the fastest path to the output. It is about using the difference between systems to find out what you actually have. The collision is sharpest when the practitioner can read the divergences, when the places where systems pull in different directions become legible as information rather than noise. That legibility is accumulated terrain knowledge. It develops the same way the think package develops, through sustained attention over time.
The change that the collision produces is not in the quality of individual outputs. It is in what the practice leaves behind. The session that compounds rather than evaporates. The artifact that raises the next starting point. The work that builds on itself because the collaboration can hold the thread between attempts in a way that working alone could not.
The thing on the someday list was not wrong about itself. It was waiting for a collision partner capable of receiving what the person had always been ready to bring. That partner is now available. Part 3 reaches what that means for the work that was waiting.
The conditions did not change. The tax changed. This is the distinction that matters. Most conversations about AI describe improving conditions, better outputs, faster turnaround, cheaper production. What happened here was different. The conditions under which the work was being attempted remained exactly as they were. A demanding full-time role, limited free time, no team, no institutional support, evenings and weekends. What changed was what evenings and weekends could now produce.
And when the tax changes, the things filed under someday stop being someday projects. Not all at once. Not without work. But the assessment that had said the math doesn't support this, that accurate, honest assessment, was made against a different set of numbers. The new numbers say something different. The list starts moving.
The bucket list starts moving.
What becomes possible when the production math changes? Part 3 of 3.
Every level had a list, different artifacts, the same structure underneath, the thing that was genuinely within reach and outside the cost the situation allowed.
For the digital tourist, the piece that was always going to be written, the answer to the question they kept getting asked, finally assembled into something they could point to. The explanation of their own area of expertise, in their own voice, that they had never had the combination of time and process and energy to produce. Small by some standards. Genuinely theirs. Produced across an evening rather than across months of uncertain intention. The tourist's bucket list item was not ambitious in the conventional sense. It was simply consistently out of reach, and now it isn't.
For the vibe coder, the tool that would have changed how the work got done, if there had been time to figure it out properly. The automation that was always too complicated to build in a single sitting but not complicated enough to justify the sustained focus it kept requiring. The prototype that would have let someone else use the process they had developed, the thing that would have made their method portable. Now attempted on a weekend. Working by Monday, not perfectly, but well enough to use and well enough to compound from.
For the actual techie, the system. The one that required either a team or 3 uninterrupted months or a completely different set of circumstances. The production pipeline. The composition engine. The research infrastructure. The thing that, if it existed, would change what every subsequent project could attempt. It is being built now, across evenings, in a role that has nothing to do with it, without the months of focused boredom that would have been required before. Not because the vision changed. Because the production math changed.
What makes the list move is not a single session. It is what the sessions leave behind. The artifact that survives in a form that raises the next starting point. The practice leaving residue. The residue making the next attempt start higher than the last one did.
The tourist saved document becomes the seed for the next session. The vibe coder's working template becomes the starting point for the next tool. The actual techie's production system becomes the infrastructure that makes everything built afterward cheaper to build. Not because anything magical happened. Because the practice was designed to leave something behind, and the something it left behind was real.
This is not the system learning. The system does not learn between sessions. What compounds is the practitioner's accumulated context, the vocabulary developed, the terrain mapped, the routing decisions made and tested, the standard of quality held consistently enough that the collaboration can calibrate to it. The compounding is in the practitioner. It always was.
There is a test for whether any of this actually worked. Not the test of whether the session felt productive. Not the test of whether the output looked finished. The test of whether what the session produced survived the distance between the making and the using. Whether the document that felt clear in the session still felt clear when you returned to it. Whether the tool that worked in context still worked in the next context. Whether the system that made sense when you built it still made sense when you had to explain it to someone else.
The sessions that compound are the ones that pass this test. The artifact survives because the density of what was brought in was real, not the private resonance of the idea, but the public signal that made it into the thing. The tourist's document is useful to someone else. The vibe coder's template works in the next person's context. The actual Techie system can be inhabited by someone who was not there when it was built. The gap between what the maker held and what the artifact carries, that gap was closed, not by accident, by the discipline of testing it before accepting it as done.
The aspirations that stayed on the list were not wrong about themselves. This is the thing that is easiest to get wrong in retrospect, to conclude that they were always unrealistic, that the assessment that said the math doesn't support this was a permanent judgment rather than a situational one. It was situational. The situation changed. The aspirations were correct about their own value all along.
The serendipitous observations. The ones held for years because something in you vouched for them before you could explain why. The connection that seemed too specific to be useful and kept presenting itself anyway. The framework that kept appearing across different domains without having been placed there deliberately. These were not imagination. They were accumulated attention. They were the base layer making itself known. They were ready long before the conditions for using them arrived.
The practice that formed here, across evenings, in ordinary circumstances, without the conditions that the work seemed to require, is now a residue. It exists. It can be pointed to. The document, the template, the system, whatever form it took, it is evidence that the accumulated structure was real, that the collision produced something, that the work left something behind that raised the next starting point. That is not a small thing. That is the whole mechanism having run. The work has started moving. Not for everyone. Or the person who had more usable work than the old production math could support. Who was being stopped by the more mundane parts of the build. Who had a list, and the patience to wait for the conditions to change, and the willingness to work when they did.
The aspirations you held because something in you vouched for them, the ones that seemed too ambitious for one person working alone, were not wrong about themselves. The conditions for attempting them just arrived later than expected. They are not gone. They are not diminished. They are waiting for exactly what you now have.